In a small neighborhood where businesses were forced to pay for their own survival, Royal Roots stood defiant, a place of warmth, resilience, and community. J-Rock and his crew saw none of that when they walked through its doors. They saw a fat black woman, apron tied around her waist, her hands dusted with the remnants of another workday. To them, she was soft, predictable, just another shop owner who would fold under pressure. They had done it before. Threats, violence, broken glass, if necessary. Everyone had a breaking point. But Ameera Williams wasn't like everyone else. Before she ever picked up a pair of shears, she had carried weapons far deadlier, trained in the art of war, survived battles that had left men like J-Rock in the dirt. She had spent years honing her instincts, sharpening her body into something built for combat, built to endure. The gang thought they were forcing a woman into submission. Instead, they were cornering a soldier, daring her to fight back. And when the dust settled, when fists had flown and blood had been spilled, it wouldn't be Royal Roots that lay in ruins. It would be them. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The steady hum of clippers, the rhythmic snip of scissors, and the warm scent of coconut oil filled Royal Roots' salon. The afternoon sun streamed through the large front window, casting golden light on the polished floors. Ameera Williams stood behind her chair, effortlessly twisting a client's thick curls into neat coils. Her hands worked with skill and purpose, but her eyes flicked toward the front of the shop, always watching, always aware. She saw him first. A young gang member, no older than 20, leaned against the lamppost across the street, pretending to scroll through his phone. He wasn't fooling anyone. The same kid had been there the past 3 days, staring through the glass, taking mental notes, testing the waters. Ameera exhaled slowly, tightening a coil with practiced ease. "Ms. Ameera, you hear what happened to Sonny's Deli?" Nia, one of her stylists, asked, lowering her voice. Ameera didn't look up. "What happened?" "They smashed his windows in last night, tagging his walls, talking about how he needs to pay his dues." A knowing silence fell over the salon. Another business hit. Another warning. Ameera nodded, finishing the last twist. She met her client's eyes in the mirror, giving her a reassuring smile. "You're all set, baby. You know the drill. Oil those roots. Wrap it at night." The client smiled back, but the weight of the conversation lingered. The door chime jingled. The shop went still. Jared J-Rock Simmons walked in like he owned the place, flanked by 2 of his men. He was tall, broad, and carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no. His presence was suffocating, filling the salon with unspoken threats. He clapped his hands together, flashing a wolfish grin. "Damn, this place is nice. Real nice." Ameera didn't stop moving. She turned toward the counter, wiping her hands on a towel, unfazed. "You lost? J-Rock?" A chuckle rippled through his crew. "Nah, I know exactly where I'm at." His grin widened, but his eyes were sharp. "Came to talk business." A tense silence filled the room. Ameera leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Then, talk." J-Rock let the silence stretch, savoring the way the tension in the room thickened, the air itself turning dense with the weight of his presence. He moved slowly, deliberately, his dark eyes dragging over every inch of the salon, lingering just long enough on each detail to make it clear that he wasn't just looking, he was claiming the space. His fingers tapped lazily against the edge of the counter as he turned back to Ameera, his gold-toothed grin widening. "You been running this little spot for what, 5, 10 years?" He clicked his tongue, shaking his head as if it truly was a shame. "Damn shame if it all went to waste." Ameera, unmoved, continued wiping her hands on the towel, her expression as solid and steady as ever. "You wasting my time? Or you getting to the point?" J-Rock's smirk faltered, just slightly. A quick flicker, like a candle caught in a sudden draft. His boys caught it. The subtle hesitation, the momentary loss of control. But J-Rock was quick, rolling his shoulders and masking the slip with a slow shake of his head. "Damn, Ameera. That's cold." His voice carried a mocking warmth, like he was disappointed but still amused by her defiance. "I'm out here, trying to help a sister out, And you acting like I'm the bad guy." One of his boys, Dre, let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "That's the thing, boss. Women like her don't ever know when they need help." J-Rock's grin stretched wider, his gaze sweeping over Amira, slow and deliberate, like he was assessing her, like she was less a business owner and more a thing to be judged. "You sitting real comfortable behind this counter, huh?" His voice dropped slightly, an undercurrent of something uglier slipping through. "Bet you been sitting real comfortable your whole damn life." Reese, the other man standing just behind him, snorted, shaking his head. "Yeah, she looked like she been eating good, putting all that money into biscuits instead of security." The laughter from his boys hit like a slap, rippling through the shop, bouncing off the walls. Nia stiffened where she stood, her jaw tightening as her grip tightened around the spray bottle she was holding. Marcus exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders like he was forcing himself to stay still. But Amira? Amira was motionless. She didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't even blink. J-Rock watched her carefully, as if waiting for something, waiting for her to break. But when she didn't fold under his stare, his grin curled into something meaner. "See, I know you're smart," he continued, stepping even closer, crowding her space. "You ain't dumb enough to think you can fight off the whole world." His voice lowered, the false friendliness melting away, leaving only the raw threat beneath. "This neighborhood, it's changing. More desperate people moving in. You never know who might walk in here one night. Maybe someone mad. Maybe someone careless." His gaze flickered toward the cash register. "Maybe someone just looking to take what they think they deserve." The weight of his words pressed against the room. Amira remained still, her voice steady and smooth when she finally spoke. "You sellin' protection?" J-Rock's lips parted into a slow grin, his teeth flashing gold. "Nah, I'm offering protection. That's the difference. This ain't some shakedown, Queen. This is community service. We just making sure everything stays peaceful." The amusement returned to his voice, but there was something meaner underneath it now. He tilted his head, eyes dancing over her frame once again, deliberately slow, deliberately insulting. "I mean, look at you," he murmured, clicking his tongue. "Built like a damn tank, but still fragile in all the ways that matter." He let out a slow whistle, shaking his head like it was truly a shame. "You ever think about what happens if, let's say, you trip one day? One bad fall, and all that weight come crashing down?" The laughter from his boys was even louder this time, bouncing off the walls, filling the salon like smoke. Nia shifted on her feet, lips pressed into a thin line, her shoulders stiff. Marcus inhaled slowly, gripping the clippers in his hand like he was considering using them for something else. J-Rock grinned, feeding off the reaction. Then, without another word, he reached over the counter and popped open the register. The click of the drawer sliding open sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Before anyone could react, he grabbed a handful of cash. A 20, a 5, a couple of ones. Not much. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he did it right in front of her. A direct challenge. The sound of rustling bills ripped through the tension. J-Rock flipped through the money lazily, rubbing the 20 between his fingers like he was testing the quality. "Damn, feels real soft," he muttered. "Guess that's what happens when you don't gotta work hard for it, huh?" Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the money onto the floor. It fluttered down between them, landing in a crumpled mess at Amira's feet. "Oops," he murmured. Then, before anyone could stop him, he reached behind him, grabbed one of the glass shampoo bottles off the shelf, and let it slip from his fingers, shatter. The bottle exploded against the hardwood floor, liquid splattering across the surface, the scent of honey and coconut oil instantly thick in the air. The salon gasped. Dre let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Damn. Clumsy as hell, boss." J-Rock turned back to Amira, watching her, waiting for her to fold, waiting for fear to settle in, waiting for her to be like the others. Amira finally moved, her thick fingers clamped around his wrist, tight, fast. like a damn vice. J-Rock froze. The laughing stopped. His boys stiffened, their cocky postures flickering with uncertainty. Amira didn't say a word. She just squeezed. J-Rock's fingers twitched. His wrist flexed against her grip, but she didn't budge. His face twitched. Not from pain, but from realization. Realization that he had just miscalculated. He yanked his arm back. Too hard, too quick, like he was escaping instead of taking control. His smirk was gone. He shoved the money back into the register, slamming the drawer shut, his jaw tight. His eyes flickered over her once more, but he didn't step closer this time. Instead, he inhaled sharply through his nose, rolling his shoulders back like he was brushing off the moment. "Aight," he said, voice a little too even. "I get it." He turned, flicking his fingers toward the door, motioning for his boys to follow. At the door, J-Rock paused, just for a second. "Next time?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge now, something darker curling beneath the surface. "I won't be so friendly." And then he was gone. The scent of broken shampoo still lingered in the air long after J-Rock and his crew walked out of Royal Roots. The shards of glass glittered under the fluorescent lights, a few larger pieces embedded in the grooves of the wooden floor. The shop had fallen into a thick silence, like the walls themselves were holding its breath. Nia was the first to move. With quick, jerky motions, she grabbed the broom from the back corner and started sweeping up the mess, her hands tight on the handle, muttering curses under her breath. Marcus bent down to help, shaking his head as he picked up the larger shards of glass with careful fingers. Amira remained where she stood behind the counter, arms crossed over her broad chest, her face unreadable. "Amira?" Nia's voice sliced through the silence, her tone sharp with anger barely held in check. "What the hell was that?" Amira didn't react. Nia threw down the broom, her patience snapping. "That was a test," she answered for her, her voice growing louder. "And what? We just ignore it? Pretend this ain't the same thing they did to Sonny's Deli before they busted out his windows? You think they're just gonna walk away?" She gestured toward the broken bottle, the spilled product seeping into the cracks of the floor. "They ain't just testing, Amira. They're warming up." Marcus ran a hand over his head, his jaw tight. "She's right," he said quietly. "We need to be real about this. You know what's coming next." Amira did know. J-Rock had already made up his mind. He had walked in here already decided that Royal Roots was his next claim. And this? This was the beginning. The next time, he wouldn't just be breaking things. The next time, he wouldn't just be making a statement. He would tear this place apart to prove a point. She should have been afraid. She wasn't. She had seen worse men than J-Rock in far worse places than this. "We keep running business as usual," she said finally, her voice level. Nia let out a sharp breath, hands going to her hips. "That's it? That's your whole plan?" Amira leaned forward against the counter, meeting her stare with an unshaken calm. "They want me scared. They want me to fold before they even have to do anything. So we keep moving. We keep working." Nia looked ready to argue, but she saw something in Amira's face that made her swallow whatever words were sitting on her tongue. She shook her head instead, grabbing the broom again and sweeping harder than necessary. Marcus, however, wasn't letting this go. "And what happens when they come back, Amira? 'Cause they will. You know how this goes. They're gonna start harassing the shop, making it impossible to do business until you give in." Amira's fingers tapped slowly against the countertop, because Marcus was right. The next morning, Royal Roots opened as usual. The neon sign flickered on, chairs were set up, stations were prepped. The scent of curling irons heating up mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee, and customers started filtering in, chatting and laughing, as if the tension from the day before hadn't soaked into the walls. But Amira knew better. It started small. At first, it was just presence. J-Rock's boys started hanging around outside, posted up on the curb across the street, leaning against parked cars, smoking and talking loudly. They weren't blocking the door, but they were watching. Always watching. Then, they started getting closer. Dre and Reese leaned against the wall right next to the entrance, their bodies relaxed, their smirks lazy. But the message was clear. Every time a customer walked in, they muttered something under their breath. Sometimes it was harmless. "Damn, sis, you look good today." Other times it was more pointed. "You sure you want to spend money here? Whole place might be gone next week." A few of the regulars started hesitating, glancing nervously at the men before stepping inside. By the third day, the gang upped the pressure. They started parking their bikes in front of the entrance, forcing customers to weave through them just to get inside. One of the younger gang members, some little punk barely out of high school, started playing his music loud as hell, the bass shaking the windows of the shop. Then the window broke, a brick, thrown in the dead of night, crashing through the glass. A picture frame shattered, a photo of Amira's mother, the woman who had inspired her to open Royal Roots in the first place. The message was clear. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about breaking her. Nia was furious when she arrived that morning. "Oh, hell no. This is war." Marcus stood next to her, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "What now, eh?" Amira bent down, picking up the picture frame from the floor, brushing the shards of glass off carefully. She didn't answer, not at first. Then, in the silence, a voice cut in. "I can file a report. But you know how this goes." Detective Kyle Burns stood in the doorway, arms crossed, looking at the damage with a look of forced sympathy. Amira exhaled through her nose. She had been expecting him. Burns was always around, the one officer that still gave this part of the neighborhood any attention. He was a man who looked exhausted, the kind of cop who had seen too much, lost too much, and stopped pretending he could fix it all. He stepped inside, glancing around. "I heard about J-Rock stopping by. And now this?" He motioned to the broken glass with a tilt of his head. "You know how these things go. You push back. They push harder." Amira's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Detective?" Burns sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "I'm saying you play it smart. You let it go. You don't poke the bear." His eyes met hers, steady. "They want you scared. They want you to react. Don't give them a reason to make it worse." Nia let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Oh, right. So she's just supposed to let them take whatever they want?" Burns's expression was careful. "I'm saying, pick your battles." Amira studied him, her expression unreadable. She had a feeling Burns wasn't just giving advice. He was warning her. "I'll take care of it," she said finally. Burns studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "Let me know if you need anything." He turned, walking out, the door closing softly behind him. The moment he was gone, Nia shook her head. "That's it? That's your grand plan? Take care of it?" Amira set the broken frame on the counter, her fingers tightening around the edge. "We get ready," she murmured. Marcus frowned. "For what?" Amira lifted her head, her reflection fractured in the remaining shards of the broken window. "For when they come back." The night after the window was shattered, Amira sat alone in Royal Roots, the lights dim. The only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the break room. The broken glass had been swept, the picture frame tucked away. But the damage remained. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even about the shop. This was a challenge. J-Rock wasn't just trying to intimidate her. He was trying to own her, trying to force her to accept that Royal Roots would never truly be hers unless he allowed it. That was never going to happen. She rolled her shoulders, exhaled, and got to work. The first thing she did was reinforce the doors. The front door had a basic lock, but that wouldn't cut it. She went to the back room, rummaging through her supply shelves until she found what she needed. A metal security bar. She fixed it into place, testing its weight, nodding in satisfaction when it held steady. No more easy break-ins. Next, she turned her attention to the windows. The broken one was already boarded up, but that wouldn't stop them from coming back for more. She measured out thick wooden panels and secured them over every vulnerable window, sealing them tight. If they wanted to get inside, they'd have to work for it. She moved through the shop like a woman possessed, reinforcing what needed to be reinforced, removing anything that could be used against her. She wasn't just securing the shop. She was fortifying it. Once the physical barriers were in place, she turned her focus to weapons. She wasn't naive. She knew that when J-Rock came back, he wouldn't just come to break things. He'd bring his people. And this time, it wouldn't just be threats and bricks. She went to her office, unlocking the small metal case she hadn't touched in years. Inside, her old Army Ranger combat knife lay on the velvet lining, polished, sharp as ever. The weight of it in her hand was familiar. She slipped it into a sheath and secured it under the counter. Then, she reached under the register, pulling out a small baseball bat. Not a cheap aluminum one. This was solid wood, weighty in her grip. She tested the swing, nodding to herself. If it came to it, she'd be ready. Blocking the doors wasn't enough. She needed to control the space. She pulled out a long roll of fishing wire from the back room and began stringing it across the main walkway, just a few inches above the ground. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to send a careless man tumbling forward. Near the shampoo station, she positioned a bucket of hot water, balanced on the edge of a shelf. A well-placed nudge, and it would fall, scalding and distracting anyone who thought they could rush her. At the back door, she scattered baby oil across the smooth floor, knowing that the second someone stormed in without thinking, they'd end up on their ass. None of it was deadly, but it would give her the upper hand. And that was all she needed. The next morning, when Nia walked in for her shift, she stopped mid-step, eyes scanning the boarded-up windows, the extra locks, the tripwires strung up near the floor. Her face twisted. The hell is all this? Marcus stepped in behind her, taking it all in, his brows raising as he eyed the baby oil gleaming on the back floor. Amira emerged from the back room, dusting her hands off on a rag. Preparation, she said simply. Nia blinked. Preparation for what? The Hunger Games? Marcus let out a low chuckle, rubbing his chin. Damn, you rigged this place like a damn battlefield. Amira shrugged. You think they're just gonna walk in and leave? J-Rock don't operate like that. When he comes back, he's coming for more than just a conversation. Nia stared at her, then at the bat leaning against the counter. You expecting a fight? I'm expecting them to push their luck. Amira met her gaze evenly. And I plan to be ready when they do. A silence settled between them. Then Marcus let out a slow breath and grinned. Hell, he said, shaking his head. Guess I better bring my work boots tomorrow. Amira smirked. Might be a good idea. Nia exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. Y'all are insane, she muttered. But when she looked at Amira again, there was something else behind the frustration. Respect. Because Amira wasn't backing down. She was getting ready. And when the time came, J-Rock was going to realize just how badly he underestimated her. The tension had been building for days. Amira knew it was coming. J-Rock wasn't the type to let a challenge go unanswered. She had humiliated him the last time he stepped foot inside Royal Roots, and men like him didn't take humiliation lightly. That night, as she locked up the shop, she took one last look at her handiwork. The reinforced doors, the traps carefully placed, the makeshift weapons stashed in easy reach. She let her fingers brush over the bat resting within arm's reach beneath the counter, feeling the weight of it, solid and familiar, before letting her hand drop to her side. Everything was in place. All that was left was to wait, and she didn't have to wait long. The first sign of their arrival came in the form of a low, rolling growl of engines outside, the deep-throated rumble of motorcycles and the occasional rev of an impatient car. The sound was unmistakable, the kind of noise that sent a shiver of anticipation through the air, announcing their presence before they even stepped foot on the pavement. Amira, standing in the darkened shop, glanced toward the clock on the wall. 11:47 p.m. Too late for casual business? Too early for the streets to be empty. Moving carefully, she stepped toward the boarded-up window, keeping her body low and out of sight, as she peered through a small gap between the wooden planks. The street outside, bathed in the dim, flickering light of the old street lamps, cast long shadows that stretched across the pavement, stretching and twisting as if they, too, sensed the violence creeping into the night. J-Rock stood at the center of the sidewalk, his arms hanging loose at his sides, his posture deceptively casual. But Amira could see the tension in his stance, the way his shoulders were drawn back just slightly, the way his head tilted forward, eyes scanning the building in front of him. He wasn't just here to make noise, he was here to take control. Flanking him were at least 6 men, each one exuding the same dangerous confidence, their expressions ranging from eager anticipation to cold calculation. One of them, tall and wiry, absent-mindedly flipped a crowbar in his hand, passing it from palm to palm as if testing the weight, while another, built like a bulldozer, rested a wooden bat on his shoulder, tapping it idly against his palm as he stared at the front door. Amira let out a slow, measured breath, feeling her heartbeat settle into a steady, controlled rhythm. She could already feel the surge of adrenaline creeping into her veins, sharpening her focus, making her hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every potential threat. This was a feeling she knew well, the same sensation she had felt countless times before, right before a fight. Outside, J-Rock let out a quiet chuckle, his breath fogging up the glass on the broken window as he reached out, running his fingers along the boarded-up section, knocking twice with his knuckles in a slow, taunting rhythm. "You in there, Queen?" His voice was smooth, almost friendly, but dripping with mockery, the kind of tone that carried the weight of a threat hidden beneath false politeness. "Come on now. Don't be rude. You knew I was coming." Amira didn't move, didn't answer. J-Rock smirked, turning slightly to glance over his shoulder at his men. "She real quiet, huh? Guess all that big talk dried up." Dre, standing off to the side with his arms crossed, let out a low snicker, shaking his head. "Bet she hidin' in the back. You know how they do. Act all tough till it's time to throw hands." J-Rock exhaled sharply, as if disappointed, then motioned lazily toward one of the men beside him. "Go ahead," he said, his tone almost bored. The man stepped forward without hesitation, gripping the crowbar tighter as he raised it, then swung it directly into the wooden boards covering the window. The impact rang out like a gunshot, the sharp crack of splintering wood reverberating through the street, making the silence that followed feel even heavier. Inside, Amira's grip tightened around the bat. Another smash followed, the force of the second hit splitting the wood, sending jagged splinters flying into the night air. J-Rock sighed, shaking his head in feigned disappointment as he pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lighting it with a flick of his lighter. "See? I tried to be nice," he murmured, exhaling a plume of smoke into the air. "Gave you a chance. Real good deal. But you wanted to be hard-headed. Now I gotta remind you who really runs this street." Another crash. The final blow shattered the wooden barrier completely, sending a cascade of debris to the sidewalk. One of J-Rock's men reached through the gap, unlocked the door from the inside, and pushed it open. Amira inhaled through her nose, slow and steady. They had just stepped into her trap. The moment the first guy pushed through the entrance, his boot caught on the fishing wire stretched across the floor, the nearly invisible thread snapping tight around his ankle. He barely had time to process what had happened before his body was yanked forward, thrown off balance, his momentum sending him crashing face first onto the floor. A loud thud echoed through the shop as he groaned, his hands scrambling beneath him in an attempt to push himself up. But before he could regain his footing, the metal shelf near the entrance tipped over, sending a rain of hot combs, shampoo bottles, and styling tools crashing onto his back. Crap! Another one of the men started to step inside, reaching for a weapon. But the moment his boots hit the tile, he lost his balance. His arms flailed wildly as his feet slipped on the thin layer of baby oil Amira had spread across the floor, his body completely failing him as he tumbled backward, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The moment he went down, Amira moved. With explosive force, she swung the bat low, aiming directly for his ribs. The wood connected with a sharp, hollow crack, the sound of bone and impact filling the air as he let out a strangled gasp, his entire body convulsing as he clutched his side in agony. J-Rock's smirk was gone. Everything had happened too fast. They had come in thinking this was an easy job, expecting her to be terrified, to beg, to surrender before they even had to lay a hand on her. But Amira wasn't begging. She was fighting back. J-Rock's face darkened, his hand twitching at his side before he pulled a switchblade from his pocket, flicking it open with a sharp metallic click. "You think you a damn superhero, huh?" he snarled, his voice filled with uncontained rage. "Think you some kind of warrior?" Amira rolled her shoulders, her grip tightening around the bat, her eyes steady as she met his glare without fear. "I ain't gotta think," she said calmly. "I am." J-Rock lunged. The sharp gleam of his switchblade slicing through the dim light of royal roots, the edge aiming straight for Amira's midsection. He moved fast, but not fast enough. Amira twisted her body at the last second, stepping sideways, letting the blade miss her by inches. Before J-Rock could recover, she grabbed his wrist with both hands, twisting hard, using the momentum of his own attack against him. The knife clattered to the floor, bouncing once, before skidding under a station chair. J-Rock barely had time to react before Amira's elbow drove into his ribs, forcing a choked gasp from his throat. He stumbled back, his hand instinctively going to his side, his face twisting in rage and disbelief. He hadn't expected this. None of them had. For a split second, the entire shop froze, the air thick with stunned silence as J-Rock's men took in what had just happened. Then chaos erupted. Dre and Reese rushed forward at the same time, their eyes burning with aggression. The one with the crowbar lifted it high, his muscles tightening for a downward swing, aimed right at Amira's head. She moved first. Her hands shot out, grabbing a salon chair by the backrest, and with a powerful heave, she swung it upward, catching the crowbar mid-air. The impact sent a violent jolt through Dre's arm, the force knocking him off balance. His grip loosened just enough for Amira to slam the chair into his chest, sending him staggering backward, crashing into a mirror with a loud, splintering shatter. The second man, Reese, charged right on Dre's heels, trying to take advantage of the distraction. His hands were balled into fists, his steps quick and heavy. But Amira had already anticipated it. She dropped low, shifting her weight onto her back foot, then thrust forward with a brutal jab, her fist colliding with the soft flesh of his throat. Reese choked, eyes bulging as he stumbled sideways, gasping for air, one hand clutching at his neck while the other flailed for balance. A third attacker tried to grab her from behind, but Amira had been in too many fights to let someone sneak up on her that easily. As soon as she felt the movement behind her, she whipped her head back, slamming the back of her skull into his face. There was a sickening crack, the unmistakable sound of a nose breaking, followed by a sharp yelp of pain as he reeled away, blood streaming down his mouth. Another man grabbed a hairdryer off the counter, swinging it like a makeshift club, aiming right for her head. Amira ducked, narrowly avoiding the strike, then drove her knee into his stomach before he could recover. He let out a pained grunt, his body folding inward, and she followed up with a savage hammer fist to the side of his jaw. His legs gave out beneath him, and he crumpled to the floor, unmoving. J-Rock, now recovered from her earlier hit, wiped his bloody nose on the sleeve of his jacket, his teeth clenched. "Get her, you dumbasses!" Two more rushed in, one grabbing a pair of scissors from the styling station, the other swinging wildly with a set of brass knuckles. Amira's body moved on instinct, years of training flooding back like muscle memory. She sidestepped the man with the brass knuckles, letting his momentum carry him forward, then grabbed his arm and whipped him around, using his own weight to send him crashing into his friend. The man with the scissors stumbled, nearly losing his grip, and in that split second, Amira struck. She brought her elbow down hard on his wrist, forcing the blade to clatter to the ground before planting a brutal kick into his knee, sending him sprawling onto his back with a pained cry. The fight wasn't just brutal, it was tactical. Amira wasn't just hitting hard, She was hitting smart. She knew how to use their size and weight against them, redirecting their force rather than trying to overpower them outright. She used the environment to her advantage, making every step, every movement, calculated and efficient. But she wasn't invincible. A heavy fist suddenly slammed into her side, knocking the breath from her lungs, pain exploding in her ribs. She gritted her teeth, absorbing the blow, but the impact had left her open. Another man, one she hadn't noticed creeping up behind her, grabbed her by the arm, yanking hard, trying to pull her off balance. For the first time, Amira's footing wavered, and that's when she saw him. Lil Trey, the youngest of J-Rock's crew, barely more than a kid, stood frozen near the entrance, his back pressed against the doorframe. His eyes were wide, darting between the carnage unfolding before him. His hands twitched at his sides like he wanted to move, but he didn't. Amira locked eyes with him. There was hesitation there, uncertainty, fear, doubt. For the first time, she saw it. He didn't want to be here. The moment lasted only a second, but in a fight like this, a second was all she needed. She twisted violently, breaking free from the man's grip on her arm, then spun on her heel, bringing her elbow up in a sharp arc, connecting squarely with his temple. He dropped instantly, his body crashing onto a pile of fallen styling products. The room was in shambles now. Mirrors cracked, chairs overturned, hair products spilled across the floor like blood in the aftermath of battle. J-Rock was still standing, barely, his chest heaving, one hand clutching his ribs. His men were either unconscious, groaning, or staggering toward the exit. Lil Trey still hadn't moved. Amira took a step toward him, voice steady, despite the bruises forming beneath her skin. "You don't gotta go down with them, kid." Trey's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his gaze darting to J-Rock, then back to Amira. J-Rock let out a pained, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Trey, if you don't get your ass in here," but the kid didn't move. Instead, he did the only thing that made sense in that moment. He ran. J-Rock's face twisted with rage as he watched him go, but he was too injured to chase after him. His focus snapped back to Amira, his glare dark and venomous. "This ain't over," he spat, his voice dripping with fury. Amira wiped a smear of blood from the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand. "No," she said, her voice firm, unshaken. "It ain't." Amira knew better than to believe the fight was over. J-Rock had taken his beating, his boys had limped out of Royal Roots, and for now, they were licking their wounds. But men like J-Rock never let humiliation sit for long. He would come back harder, meaner, with a plan that went beyond bricks through windows and broken furniture. And the worst part? He wasn't the only problem. Amira had seen it in Detective Burns's face during his last visit. The way he spoke with just a little too much familiarity about how these things go. How he had told her to play it smart, like he was offering her some kind of lifeline. The moment he stepped into her shop after the first attack, she had felt it in her gut. He wasn't here to help her. He was here to keep things quiet, to make sure the pieces fell in the right place. She just didn't know whose side he was really on, yet. So Amira did what she had always been good at. She watched. She waited. And when the time was right, she followed. It had been 3 days since the attack on Royal Roots, and Amira had kept a low profile, running her shop as usual, making repairs where she could, and keeping an eye on her surroundings. J-Rock's boys had stopped hanging around outside, not because they were afraid, but because they were planning something bigger. Amira didn't believe in coincidences, and the fact that Burns hadn't been back to check in only made her more suspicious. So when she spotted his unmarked car parked outside a rundown bar on the south side of town late that night, she didn't hesitate. She followed on foot, staying back, keeping to the shadows. Burns wasn't in uniform, which meant this wasn't official police business. That meant he was up to something. The bar he had entered was a place she had seen before. The Pit, a hole-in-the-wall joint known for backroom deals and criminals who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. Burns didn't belong here. Unless he did. Amira slipped inside, keeping her hood up, her steps careful and measured. The air smelled like cheap beer, sweat, and bad decisions. Dim lights flickered overhead, illuminating the cracked bar stools and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. A few men sat hunched over their drinks, barely looking up when she passed. She spotted Burns near the back, tucked into a booth with J-Rock sitting across from him. Her stomach tightened. There it is. J-Rock's face was still bruised from their last encounter, a faint purple mark near his jaw. But he wasn't acting like a man who had been beaten down. He was leaning forward, talking low, confident. Burns, on the other hand, looked tired, rubbing his face as he listened, nodding occasionally. Amira moved closer, finding a darkened corner near the bar where she could eavesdrop without drawing attention. J-Rock's voice carried, just enough for her to catch bits and pieces. Told you it was handled. Burns let out a harsh breath. Handled? You call what happened at that shop handled? You're lucky nobody got killed. J-Rock chuckled, the sound low and amused. Ain't my fault my guys got sloppy. What? You expect me to just let her slide? Burns leaned in, his voice tight. I expect you to keep things quiet. You keep pushing, people start asking questions, and that's bad for both of us. Amira clenched her jaw. So that was it. Burns wasn't just letting J-Rock operate, he was protecting him. J-Rock smirked, swirling the drink in his glass. Man, relax. Nobody gonna find out you've been keeping the heat off me. You do your job, I do mine, and we both eat. That was the deal, wasn't it? Burns didn't answer right away. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face, before muttering, Yeah, that was the deal. Amira felt the weight of those words settle into her bones. Burns wasn't just on J-Rock's payroll. He was making sure J-Rock stayed in power. She had suspected corruption in the department. Hell, everyone in the neighborhood did, but now she had proof. And proof was dangerous, because it meant she wasn't just up against J-Rock anymore. She was up against the system protecting him. Amira didn't stick around to hear the rest. She had heard enough. Moving as silently as she came, she slipped out of the pit and back into the night, her mind already racing. This wasn't just about Royal Roots anymore. If J-Rock had cops keeping his pockets lined, then no amount of police reports, no amount of waiting on justice was going to save her shop. She needed to expose this. She needed to make it undeniable. Because if Burns was the reason J-Rock had never been taken down before, then she was going to be the reason he went down now. But she had to be careful. If she made one wrong move, she wouldn't just have J-Rock coming after her. She'd have the entire dirty half of the department doing the same. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool night air ground her. Then she did what she did best. She started planning. Amira didn't go home that night. After what she had seen at the pit, she knew there was no turning back. J-Rock wasn't just some gang leader shaking down local businesses. He was protected, shielded by a system that was just as corrupt as he was. And Burns, the so-called law in this city, wasn't just looking the other way. He was making sure J-Rock stayed in power. She sat alone in Royal Roots, the dim light from the street lamp outside flickering through the boarded-up windows, her fingers tracing the edges of her phone as she replayed the recording in her mind. Every word, every smug admission, every piece of evidence that Burns and J-Rock had given her without even realizing it. She had everything she needed. Now, all she had to do was use it. The first call she made was to Marcus. She didn't bother easing into it. There wasn't time. As soon as he picked up, she simply said, I need you at the shop. Now. There was no hesitation. On my way. 15 minutes later, Marcus walked into Royal Roots, shutting the door behind him with a quiet click. His presence filled the room. Solid. Steady. The kind of man you wanted at your back when things got ugly. He took one look at Amira and knew. You got something, he said, his voice calm but expectant. She slid her phone across the counter, pressing play on the recording. Burns's voice filled the room, his own words digging his grave. Look, just keep it quiet, and I'll make sure patrols stay off your block. You know how this works. Just pay your dues, and I'll keep things smooth. Marcus listened without speaking, his face unreadable as the recording played out, as J-Rock's laughter mixed with Burns's tired acceptance of their arrangement. When it ended, he exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You got 'em. I got a piece of them," Amira corrected, her jaw tightening. "But I need all of them in one place. One hit. No escapes." Marcus leaned back against the counter, rubbing a hand over his beard as he considered it. "And what's the bait?" She met his eyes without hesitation. "Me." The plan had to be perfect. It had to look real. It had to look like Amira was desperate. She made sure the right people overheard her doubts, let it slip that she was finally ready to be smart about the situation, that she had seen the bigger picture and was willing to play along. She let it be known that she wanted to make things right before J-Rock escalated further. J-Rock took the bait with zero hesitation. His ego wouldn't let him believe otherwise. Burns set up the meeting, picking the location himself, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Neutral ground, a place where Amira wouldn't have any backup, any control. He thought he was being careful, thought he was setting the terms. What he didn't know was that Amira had chosen the location herself. By the time night fell, Marcus had already been inside the warehouse for hours, setting everything up. He wasn't just an ex-Marine. He was a tactician, a fighter, a man who knew how to turn any environment into an advantage. By the time the meeting was set, the warehouse was ready. J-Rock and Burns thought they were walking into a negotiation, but in reality, they were walking into a battlefield. Amira stood alone in the center of the warehouse, arms crossed, her stance casual but deliberate. She could hear the low rumble of an approaching engine, the slow roll of cars pulling up outside, the sharp slam of doors as men stepped out onto the cracked pavement. J-Rock entered first, his usual swagger intact, though his face still carried the bruises from their last encounter. He had 4 men with him, their movements confident, lazy, like they had already won. They weren't just carrying weapons. They were relaxed about it, their hands resting near holsters, near blades tucked into belts. Burns followed close behind, dressed in plain clothes, no badge, no sign that he was anything but a criminal in uniform. His eyes swept the space, scanning for anything out of place, but he didn't see what wasn't obvious. Everything looked empty. Everything looked exactly how they expected. Amira didn't move, didn't react. She just watched as J-Rock sauntered forward, shaking his head with an almost amused look on his face. "Now that's more like it," he said, gesturing around the room like he owned it. "See? This is how things should have been from the start. You being smart, finally realizing how crap works around here." Amira tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "That's so," J-Rock smirked. "You knew you didn't have a choice. You can fight all you want, but in the end, you fall in line." Burns stepped forward, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets. "You made the right call, Williams." His voice was quieter than J-Rock's, more measured, but it carried the same certainty, the same arrogance. "This is bigger than your shop. You had to know that." Amira let the silence hang between them for a moment, letting them settle into their victory. Then she exhaled slowly, tilting her chin slightly. "So, what happens now?" J-Rock grinned. "Now? You sign over a piece of your profits, make things easy, and in return, we make sure nothing happens to you. We keep everything peaceful." Amira smiled, but there was no warmth in it. She could feel it. The shift, the moment before the storm breaks. Because J-Rock and Burns still thought they were in control. They still thought they were leading this conversation. What they didn't know was that Marcus was in the rafters, waiting for the signal. What they didn't know was that every exit had been cut off. What they didn't know was that the fight hadn't ended at Royal Roots. It was just beginning. Amira shifted her weight slightly, her stance relaxing just enough to make J-Rock smirk. He thought he had won. Good. Let him think that, for just a few more seconds. Because the next time he blinked, he'd realize he had just walked into his own damn grave. The warehouse was silent, the kind of silence that comes before a storm, heavy with unspoken threats, and the quiet arrogance of men who thought they had already won. J-Rock stood in front of Amira, his smirk widening as she remained still, drinking in what he believed was her surrender. Burns, standing slightly behind him, wasn't smiling. His posture was stiff, his hands deep in his jacket pockets, his eyes flickering over the space like a man who was starting to sense something wasn't quite right. Amira let them enjoy their illusion of victory for a moment longer before reaching into her pocket. She didn't move fast, didn't give them reason to react. She simply pulled out her phone, tapped the screen once, and let the sound fill the warehouse. Burns's own voice echoed off the metal walls. "Look, just keep it quiet, and I'll make sure patrols stay off your block. You know how this works." J-Rock's smirk faltered, but only slightly. His gaze slid toward Burns, amused, but not yet concerned. "Damn," he chuckled, shaking his head. "That's crazy, cop. She got you real good." Amira didn't stop the recording. "Just pay your dues and I'll keep things smooth. Ain't nobody gonna find out you've been keeping the heat off me. You do your job, I do mine, and we both eat. That was the deal, wasn't it?" Burns stiffened. His face lost color, his mouth parting slightly as if scrambling for an excuse. He turned sharply toward J-Rock, his voice a hushed, angry whisper. "You said you had this handled." J-Rock, who had been amused a moment ago, now had a muscle ticking in his jaw. His hands curled into fists at his sides, and when he spoke, his voice was darker, more measured. "And you said the cops wouldn't be a problem." For the first time since they stepped inside, they weren't looking at Amira as their common enemy. They were looking at each other. That was all she needed. "You two done?" she asked, her tone calm, almost lazy. "Or you want to argue some more before I take you both apart?" J-Rock's head snapped toward her, his arrogance returning as if he had momentarily forgotten who was standing in front of him. His lips curled into something between amusement and irritation. "See, now I know you lost your damn mind." His fingers flexed at his sides, rolling his neck like a fighter about to step into a ring. "You really think you're walking out of here?" Amira exhaled through her nose, rolling her own shoulders, loosening up. "I don't think," she murmured. "I know." The moment hung between them, a single breath of stillness before the tension snapped. J-Rock moved first. He lunged, swinging with a wild, confident hook, putting all of his weight into it, aiming to drop her with one hit. Amira ducked smoothly, letting his fist sail just inches above her head. She was already moving before he could recover, stepping inside his reach, planting her foot, and driving her elbow deep into his ribcage. The impact was sharp, enough to make him grunt and stumble slightly, but he was too big to drop from just one hit. He twisted, throwing a knee toward her stomach, but Amira caught it with both hands, twisted sharply, and sent him sprawling onto the concrete floor. J-Rock's boys reacted instantly. Dre was the first to rush in, a heavy-set man with fast hands. He came in swinging, his fists aiming for her face, but Amira leaned back, weaving through the strikes with controlled precision. The moment he overextended, she caught his wrist, yanked him forward, and drove her knee into his stomach. He choked, doubling over. She grabbed the back of his neck and drove him headfirst into the nearest crate. Burns, who had been frozen up until now, seemed to realize the shift in control. He lunged from behind, trying to grab Amira in a chokehold, but she had felt him coming. She twisted at the last second, grabbing his arm, using his own momentum to flip him over her shoulder and onto the cold concrete with a heavy slam. Burns groaned, struggling to get up, but before he could, Marcus emerged from the shadows. His boot came down hard on Burns's chest, pinning him in place. "Nah," Marcus said, his voice low. "You sit this one out." Meanwhile, J-Rock had pushed himself back to his feet, shaking off the hit. His eyes burned with humiliation and rage. "All right," he muttered, rolling his shoulders. "You want to do this the hard way?" He charged again, this time more controlled, more focused. He threw a sharp feint with his right, but his real attack came from his left. A tight, powerful uppercut meant to break through her defense. Amira saw it coming. She sidestepped at the last second, avoiding the blow entirely, and before he could reset, She slammed her fist into his throat. J-Rock choked, his breath hitching as he stumbled back, gasping, his hands instinctively going to his neck. Amira didn't stop. She